All right. So my presentation is called Feel Like Quitting, Lung Screening and Smokers' Emotions. So lung screening using low dose computed tomography, LDCT, has demonstrated benefits in the literature through early detection. It can reduce lung cancer mortality risk by 20% compared to X-ray, 24% compared to no screening. But where it's been available, screening uptake has been really low. Following implementation of a national lung cancer screening program in the US in 2015, only 4.4% of the eligible population participated. Those most at risk of dying from lung cancer continue to be least likely to access screening. Previous research examining barriers and facilitators to lung cancer screening, often underpinned by the health belief model from social psychology, suggests that smokers decline participation due to the inconvenience of accessing screening, perceptions of little benefit, people saying maybe they have a low perceived risk of lung cancer, or that they're too far gone, that they're too old to benefit from it, and a mistrust of the healthcare system. Some studies also emphasize stigma, with smokers deterred or otherwise impacted by concerns about judgmental interactions with health professionals. But no studies have explicitly focused on emotion as a moderator of engagement to low dose computed tomography or LDCT lung cancer screening. But emotions, of course, are pretty important, and they have been found to be central to other forms of screening. Fear and embarrassment, along with disgust, predict lower likelihood of bowel screening. And in breast screening studies, desires to avoid discomfort and evade or assuage worry have been found to underpin decisions to attend screening. Worry, anxiety, and fear of a cancer diagnosis have also been found, but often implicitly, to be reasons for avoiding or engaging with lung cancer screening. So despite research in other cancer types and recognition that some emotions are present in relation to lung cancer, and screening emotions have nevertheless received very little attention in this space. So drawing on psychological as well as sociological conceptualizations of emotion and scholarship, which conceptualizes emotion as cognitive, physiological, and relational, we ask what emotions are experienced before, during, and following an LDCT lung cancer screening scan. In conjunction with the International Lung Screening Trial, ILST, we conducted semi-structured interviews with smokers undergoing the lung screening at one site, at the Brisbane research site. Participants for the Australian arm of the study were recruited through media advertisements, inviting people over 55 but under 80 who identified as current or former heavy smokers, defined as 30 pack years of smoking or more, and were proficient in English. They were invited to contact the research team via telephone to determine their eligibility and schedule a screening. So from the larger sample at the Brisbane site of 595 participants, 27 eligible current smokers volunteered to participate in the qualitative sub-study. So they took part in semi-structured interviews directly following their lung screening and prior to receiving their scan result, which was mailed out to their GPs a few weeks after the screening. And you can see on the slide, we had more male participants and female participants. Most were in their 50s and 60s and married and Caucasian. And they tended to be, in terms of education levels, having not completed high school or Cert 3, very few had undergraduate or postgraduate qualifications. Half were employed, and notably, in terms of smoking history, most of the participants had started smoking before they had turned 18. So following transcription, interviews were analyzed thematically by the team, and we identified within the interview data a range of emotions, ranging from anger, ambivalence, and anxiety through to pride, shame, sadness, and worry. And in this presentation, though, I'll focus on the emotions most relevant to screening. As current smokers, many of the participants, 15, described feeling stigmatized. Metaphors of dangerous illness, exile, and burden that are pretty familiar to us, like leper, social pariah, and outcast, scourge on society, were frequently employed to illustrate their perceived treatment by others and feelings of shame and isolation. For some, the stigma associated with smoking and lung cancer left them feeling alone and unsupported. But participant 20 said that the screening actually made her feel cared for. She said, it's nice for someone to have interest in smokers because we're like a section of the community that's not too highly regarded. As soon as someone gets lung cancer, oh, I bet you they were a smoker. Like you've done it to yourself. It's nice for someone to take an interest in people who have such an addiction. Responses to stigma interestingly varied by gender, with more women than men. So 7 out of the 11 women and 2 of the 16 men reported concealing smoking and lying to family about quitting, and feeling smoking related shame. So we don't talk about this in this publication, but in another one, we talk about the extent that the participants describe going to hide their smoking from family members. One participant said, you know, when their spouse goes to the shops, that's when they smoke, and then they take a full shower, wash their hair, light candles, do a quick toothbrush before their partner comes home so that they can hide it. Stigma also appeared to be really absorbed and deflected differently, with women seeming to kind of internalize the stigma and kind of changing where they smoked. So we see this with P23. It's my own fault. People make you feel like you're dirty because you do it. Ew, smokers. I just feel like I'm a dirty person now. Most people don't even know I smoke because it's something you do in private. Men, in contrast, seem to acknowledge and defiantly reject the associated stigma. So P10 says, I'm having a cigarette. Somebody walks past me, coughs. Well, piss off. Just leave me alone. I don't need somebody. Oh, you're not supposed to be smoking here. In terms of emotions prior to the screening, fear, worry, guilt, and sadness were really common in response to the question, what prompted you to volunteer for the study? Participants described ongoing cancer worries fueling their fear. Lung cancer, it sits there as a black mark. It's always in the back of your brain. And while several participants described a general fear of cancer or the unknown, others recounted a really specific fear of the debilitating symptoms and short prognosis associated with advanced lung cancer. So we see this with P2. It would be awful. See people struggling to breathe. It's horrible. It scares me. I don't want to be like that. Participants' reasons for volunteering for the screening included assuaging fears through receiving a negative scan result or an early positive but treatable result, confirming their fears, and allowing preparation for death was another reason. P23, for example, said, I know it's going to get me, but wanted to confirm the diagnosis at an early stage, saying, I saw it in my dad, nursed him through lung cancer. I would like to be more prepared than he was. And in addition to confirming fears, screening was a way of attending to feelings of guilt for not quitting. So here again, P23 talks about protecting her son from the sadness she experienced in losing her father. So my son's 17. Mommy's still smoking. He watched Pop die horrendously of lung cancer. I don't want to do that to him. I would never let him see me the way I saw my dad. Few participants recounted any emotions relating to the screening itself, with most describing the process as fine, easier than expected, or excellent. But one found the breathing test difficult, and a minority recalled feeling anxious about breathing tests and LDCT itself. Following the screening and in discussing quit attempts, 11 of the 27 interviewees described a range of negative emotions, including frustration, disappointment, stress at their inability to quit smoking. For example, P25 said, I was terrified, anxious, just at the thought of not being able to smoke. I couldn't do that. I can't do that. Then with the vape, I found that still satisfied the sucking as well as probably the nicotine. And interestingly, mentions of nicotine addiction like this one were very few. Instead, participants really emphasized individual responsibility, and those who are familiar with the lung cancer and the smoking literature will not be surprised to hear that. Participants viewed failed attempts as evidence of weakness. These beliefs seemed to lead to a resignation that if they were diagnosed with lung cancer, they'd brought it on themselves or deserved it. Participants also described frustration associated with other life stressors. Cigarette smoking was depicted as an important means of coping with these stressors, making quitting during periods of high stress more difficult. So P3, for example, says, once I get over the current stress, I'd say there's a fair chance of successfully quitting. And references to joy or happiness as a potential barrier to quitting were noted in 7 interviews, with P2, for example, saying, I really do enjoy smoking. It does help me relax. I do feel probably happier when I smoke. In terms of predicted emotions following screening, participants were asked to predict their reactions to their screening results. And responses ranged from dread and fear to resignation, ambivalence, hope, and joy. For those who feared their scan would show signs of cancer and believed cancer diagnosis to be, quote, my own fault for smoking, they dreaded the anticipated guilt and shame they would experience when they had to disclose the diagnosis to their family. And some were even fearful that implied blame would make them undeserving of care, with P27 saying, it's my own fault. You see in the papers where certain doctors won't operate on anyone because they've been a smoker. So it's like, I wouldn't go ask for any help because doctors say, well, she's been a smoker. Why should we help her? And this makes me feel as if I'm not worthy of being helped because I did it to myself, with P27 crying and sniffing in. 3 participants denied having strong emotions about the expected scan outcome. And this ambivalence was tied to feelings of resignation about the perceived inevitable outcome of a lung cancer diagnosis. For P4, others were less certain of their expected scan results, but predicted a clear scan would prompt celebration and joy. A scan confirming cancer would, for some participants, elicit fear, which P16 hoped would frighten her into quitting, saying, well, I'm hoping with this, when the screening results come out and I see how pathetic I am, it's going to scare the pants off me, and I'll think, right, that's it. But for another participant, scan results showing cancer would be cause for fear and joy, fear related to the diagnosis, and joy as it would symbolize permission to continue smoking, saying, you would hope it doesn't come back with negative results because that is the scary part. And if they were abnormal, oh, I'd smoke twice as much. Run the credit card bills up. Not all participants, however, described strong emotions about their anticipated results. These participants were dealing with other things which overshadowed concerns about their own health. So P21 sadness and grief are really illustrated here, with P21 saying, for a lot of people, it would probably be that screening would make them focus more on potential cancers, make them worry more. Maybe some of them might become a bit obsessed with it, have it affect their sleeping, but none of that has been the case with me because our son died 2 years ago and that's all I can think about, not this. That's why I'm not sleeping. So any worries I have are nothing to do with potential psychological effects of the screening. So in sharp contrast to the health confirming motives of women undergoing breast screening that we've seen in other literature, smokers in this study sought screening to address fears, especially after witnessing the horrible effects of advanced lung cancer, and to confirm an anticipated cancer diagnosis, allowing opportunity for either treatment or preparation before death. While the conclusions are limited to only those who participated, they support recent research suggesting that prioritizing emotions in lung screening invitations could be very important and effective. So some feared that as smokers, they would be considered undeserving of care. And such fears reflect internalization of stigma pronounced amongst women smokers in the study, which is likely an unintended outcome of stigmatizing public health campaigns. This provides insight into the gendered emotional impact of smoking stigma in the context of screening and underscores calls to reduce stigmatization and stigmatizing language in public health campaigns. Furthermore, the study shows that lung screening may be a way to counter stigma by helping smokers to feel supported. So previous studies have all emphasized screening as an opportunity to provide person-centered care, but our research suggests that attending to emotions should be central to these kinds of endeavors. P21's feelings of ambivalence towards their screening outcome due to their ongoing grief serve as a reminder that physical health may not be the primary concern for individuals engaging with screening. So pairing lung screening with emotional support may be equally as important as offering cessation counseling. So given the centrality of emotions to everyday life, screening implementation should consider the emotions of the target population if screening is to have a discernible impact on lung cancer mortality. Although prior work has identified a lot of barriers and motivators to screening following popular social psychology models like the health belief model, Emotions are an important but neglected facet of screening uptake and experience. And understanding the emotional context and the social environment in which these emotions unfold can inform screening recruitment strategies and improve the low rates of uptake seen to date. All right. So I think at the start, Kerryn and I were talking about perhaps saving the questions to the end. Are you guys happy with that? If we save all the questions up, and feel free to write them in the chat window now if you just can't hold on to it. With that in mind, shall we shift over to you, Gabriel?
Yep, sure. Just 1 second. So can everyone see that? Perfect. Okay, so hi everyone. My name's Gabe, and I'm in Melbourne, so I'm presenting on Wurundjeri land, and I'd just like to pay my respects to Aboriginal elders, past, present, and emerging. So today I'll be presenting a paper from my PhD research titled "No Time for a Timeout: Managing Time Around Non-Drinking." And I'd just like to point out the contributions made by my supervisors and co-authors, Amy, Sarah, and Dan, and note that my PhD is based at the Centre for Alcohol Policy Research at La Trobe University. So just for a bit of background context, my PhD is examining changes in alcohol use by Australian teenagers. So drinking is a practice associated with a range of personal, social, and cultural meanings. But what we've actually seen in recent trends in teenage drinking is that they've been going down over the past 20 years. So among 14 to 19-year-olds, abstention has more than doubled from 25% in 2001 up to 56% in 2019. While single occasion risky drinking, which is defined as having more than 4 standard drinks at once, halved from 40% down to 20% in that same time period. So in general, since the early 2000s, what we've seen is more young people in Australia reporting abstaining from drinking, delaying their first drink, or drinking proportionately less than previous cohorts at the same age. Now, for this paper, we wanted to look at time. So time is closely linked to the demands of institutional forms of work, such as education and paid employment. And young people use these types of work as a reference point for how they manage their time. So social practices like drinking alcohol have commonly been considered a way to achieve a collective time out, where young people designate times and contexts away from responsibilities, drink to socialize and to have fun with their friends. So drinking and intoxication are important for how young people share, stop, and subvert time by living in the moment. However, young people also face increasing time pressures around education, work, and uncertainty for the future, which means these time-out benefits previously associated with alcohol may have changed or diminished. So although work and free time have largely been constructed as opposites with clear temporal boundaries, Theodore Adorno argued that this was a bit of a misleading division. So instead, he suggested that free time was more of an informal extension of work. So it was a form of compensation where people were required to escape and recuperate for the next working day. So it could be filled with distractions and minor pleasures, such as the consumption of goods and entertainment, but it was never completely free from the pressures and the constraints of work. His work also identified this kind of these blurring work-life boundaries that are really relevant today, as competitive labour conditions really pressure young people to use their free time efficiently by undertaking forms of non-standard work and self-commodification in order to be ready for the future. Free time as a continuation of work has also been enabled by digital technology, which has allowed work to bleed over into personal time in new ways, such as via emails and messages outside business hours, and the ability to stay connected to work at all times. And this concept of free time could suggest that Drinking might act as a form of pleasure and escape from work. However, we propose that for young people, this lack of temporal boundaries around work increasingly demands their mental and emotional energy. As a consequence, alcohol may not be able to provide a positive distraction or a sense of renewal, and it might be less important for young people in enabling their timeouts. So my PhD research is based on 50 semi-structured interviews I conducted a couple of years ago with teenagers aged 16 to 19 from around Melbourne. Because the aim of the research was to examine changes in drinking and attitudes towards alcohol, all the participants were either abstainers or light drinkers, which for this study meant that they drank less than 4 standard drinks on a single occasion. They were recruited through social media, online advertising, word of mouth, and snowball sampling. And while we initially intended to examine leisure, we found that there was a lot of crossover between the way participants talked about leisure, work, study, and social interactions, where time and the management of time acted as this kind of unifying theme, this anchor. So using Adorno's concept of free time as a framing, the functions of ascribed to free time were grouped into 3 broad and sometimes conflicting themes, which I'll get into now. So the first theme we identified was the need for free time to be productive. So a lot of participants talked about this imperative to use time productively and focus on the future, often by prioritizing their education. This meant putting in time towards studying and pursuing personal development goals. It also included developing creative skills, learning things online, developing themselves through exercise and sport, and through other extracurricular activities. These were sometimes targeted towards enhancing their CVs or like building a kind of a clear career trajectory. Participants also talked about blending work and free time with friends through study group sessions and extracurricular activities, or by using social media platforms to both socialize and make themselves look good for potential employers. Because being productive was associated with securing the future, free time spent on parties and drinking was sometimes described as an unwanted distraction. While most participants did attend parties and many still drank some alcohol, this unproductive time was just something that they actively and consciously needed to manage. So the second theme we identified was how opportunistic free time was. So even though most participants were not in paid employment, their free time was often fragmented and unstructured. They talked about restrictions such as schoolwork, casual employment, and parental expectations, around which they had to flexibly organize their time. So because of this, a lot of their free time spent socializing was opportunistic. For example, spending time with friends on weekends and holidays when they could. Commonly, this also meant using digital technology, such as gaming, streaming, social media, as a flexible way to spend time with friends. Social media also provided opportunities for participants to organize meetups and find events or activities to attend, including parties, where most drinking occurred. However, because participants were in their final stages of school, they described peak periods of assessment and schoolwork around which they had to plan their lives. And this was really a dynamic schedule that varied from participant to participant, which sometimes made it difficult to make plans and limited their attendance at some social events. So the final theme identified was the need for free time to be restorative. This included a mix of solitary and social practices that were important for the participants to recover from work. So solitary practices were often immersive, like watching movies or TV shows, listening to music, playing sport, reading, and playing video games. These didn't revolve around drinking, which was very much considered a social activity. And these solitary activities were really important for them to recover and just relax. But participants did also talk about socializing in ways that were often consumption-based. So such as eating out, having coffee catch-ups, going shopping or going to the movies. And this also included celebrations like parties where drinking occurred. So for some, parties provided this renewed sense of energy and escape, like you're spending all this time with your friends in a situation that is different from school and different from escape from all these pressures. However, a lot of participants talked about how they still needed to be managed among these competing priorities, and with some considered parties to take too much time and energy, meaning they didn't provide this kind of positive sense of restoration. So Adorno's theory of free time as an extension of work was really useful for interpreting how our sample of young, light and non-drinkers managed their free time. So for these young people, the boundaries between free time and work commitments, including education and thinking about the future, were really unclear and bound by resources, institutions and economic rationales. So this created pressures around making the most of free time, not in a way that encouraged partying and drinking, but in a way that encouraged sort of more of a cultivation of free time. So similar work by Batchelor and co. They sort of highlighted how young people use their free time to cultivate skills and experiences in an attempt to control their life trajectories and control the future a bit more. So here we found that these temporal anxieties about how to best manage time suggested this kind of fragmented and pressure-filled patterns of time that challenged drinking as an important and accessible time and activity for our participants. And I'd just like to finish by acknowledging the broader research team and the funding that I've received for my PhD. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Gabe. So am I right in saying that Carys, you're up next?
Yes, great. I'll share my screen. So, hello everyone, my name is Carys. I'm at UQ, I'm a PhD student, very close to submission. So I'm going to talk to you today about my research that looks at the socio-demographic factors that are associated with the accumulation of stressors in Australian families. So stressors can refer to many different things. And what my research looks at is this framework of adverse childhood experiences. So these are chronic ongoing stressors that can affect families across the world. And they cover 5 types of child maltreatment and 5 types of household dysfunction. So I'm going to focus primarily today on the household dysfunction type of stressors. So these include having parents who are separated or divorced, witnessing domestic violence, living with someone who has a mental health condition or substance use problem, and living with someone who becomes incarcerated. So there's a big wide range of literature across the world that's shown that each of these 10 types of adversity or stressor can individually have impacts on people across their life. And there's also a cumulative impact whereby the more types of stressors a young person experiences, the more likely they are to have poor outcomes across their lifetime. And that can impact their health, their well-being, and also their socioeconomic status. So it can make young people less likely to grow up to have a good level of employment, and it can also impede them from having good educational attainment, and then that impacts them subsequently across their lives. So there's big sort of cumulative rolling impacts for young people who experience these sorts of stresses in their lives. So we don't yet know a whole lot about the demographic characteristics of young people who experience these kinds of cumulative stresses. So in the international literature, it's been found that some socio-demographic characteristics, like having a low-income household and having parents with low education and low employment, so children who have these characteristics might be more likely to have higher levels of stresses in their lives. And then in Australia, we primarily have evidence about characteristics that are associated with risk for individual types of stressor rather than the cumulative impact of stresses. So again, so low socioeconomic status area, and living in a remote area, and children who are Indigenous. So children with these characteristics might be more likely to experience some kinds of maltreatment and to live with parents who have got mental health conditions. But we don't know about the demographic characteristics of children who are more likely to experience a higher level of stressors and therefore be more likely to have poor outcomes across their lifetime. So that's what my research looks at. So I look at the demographic characteristics that are associated with having a cumulative presence of stressors in children's lives, and then how that might impact their outcomes across the lifetime. So the part of my research I'm going to talk to you today about is this first part of the model, where we're looking at the demographics associated with those stressors accumulating in young people's lives. So the analysis that I did used the National Health Survey from 2014 and 15. And from that large national survey, I took out a subsample of all of the adults who lived with children between the ages of 0 and 17. So, sorry, I was just checking the chat because I saw it flash up. So, yeah, so that provided me with a sample of just over 4,000 adults. And between those 4,000 adults, they lived with almost 8,000 children. But the respondents were the adults rather than the children. So those adults were aged between 18 and 82, but about 99% of them were aged under 64. So they were most likely the parents of those children. So that's why I will often refer to them as parents. So these adults were personally interviewed individually for the survey, and it's a quantitative survey. And it captures 3 types of stressor. So it captures the separation or divorce of those adults. It captures whether those adults live with mental health conditions or if they report that they have substance abuse problems. So with this data, I was able to have a look at the number of stressors that these children were experiencing, and also then compare that to the demographic characteristics of those children. So what I found was that around about a third of all the children who were represented in this sample had experienced at least one of these 3 kinds of stressor in their lives. And when I had a look at the kinds of stressors that they were experiencing, I compared that to national report data. And I found that so around 20% of the children had experienced separation or divorce, and around 20% lived with a parent who had mental illness, and only just under 1% of them were reported to live with a parent who had substance abuse problem. So the rates that you can see here, so the purple bar is what's reported in the National Health Survey, so in my analysis, and then the red bar here is what's reported in Australian national reports. So the rates for separation and divorce were quite similar, so 18% to 21%. And the rates for mental illness were also roughly similar. However, the rates for substance abuse that's reported in this survey appears to be much lower than what we would expect based on the Australian national reports. So the National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children reported that around 17% of all Australian children live with a parent with a substance abuse problem. However, this survey that I'm using only picks up on about 1% of children having that problem. So it looks like there's potentially some underreporting going on in this survey. So that's just something to bear in mind when we're interpreting the data. So it looks like the adversities we're primarily able to speak about with this data is the separation, divorce, and mental illness, and with some children also experiencing substance abuse problems in their household. So what I did was I had a look at the number of adversities that a young person had experienced, and then I put into a regression with that as the outcome, these demographic characteristics. So we had a look at the Indigenous status of the children, the language they spoke at home, their parents' employment and education, household income, and the socioeconomic status of the area in which they live. So we have demographics here that relate to the individual, the household, and their area. And we also included interactions between the area level variable of area socioeconomic status, looked at the interaction of that with employment, education, and income, because those things are so closely related. And what we found is that in this multivariate analysis, children were more likely to experience cumulative stressors if they lived in a household where there was a low level of income, if their parents were unemployed or not in the labour force, or if they lived in an area with low socioeconomic status. And then this risk was even more so for children who experienced multiple of these characteristics in conjunction with one another. So young people who lived in a low SES area and also had parents with low employment or low income were at even greater risk for having a higher number of stressors in their lives, and so therefore might be impacted across their lifetime. So what this research shows us is that even when we have data that's got quite a limited number of stressors present in it, and even when we've got underreporting that seems to be going on, it seems that these adverse childhood experiences are very common in Australian children. And these experiences are associated with socio-demographic characteristics at multiple levels. So characteristics of children at the individual level, at the household level, and at their area level, those things all work in conjunction with one another to influence the risk that these children are going to be experiencing multiple types of stresses in their lives, and therefore might be having poor outcomes across their lifetime. So this is really important first step in investigating these relationships. And I'm hoping that down the track, my research might be able to inform policy, investment, and practice to identify families and communities who are likely to experience stresses and the associated outcomes across their lifetime. So the data set that we used gave us a large sample, but it still only had 3 kinds of diversity, and there was potentially some underreporting. So my next steps of my research are going to be looking at other forms of data to explore these questions. And I'm going to be looking at longitudinal data to explore the co-development and causal pathways between stressors and demographics, and then also looking at parenting and child outcomes to see how these things all work together to inform child well-being and socioeconomic well-being across their lifetime. So I'd be very happy to take questions at the end of the session, and to also hear your thoughts about this line of research, and to find out how we might be able to work together to progress this line of very important research. So thank you for your time, and I'll pass over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Carys. So our last presenter, we have Kerryn from UNSW.
Okay, I'm just gonna start the slideshow from beginning. Okay, is that coming up okay for everyone?
We're just seeing your, oh, I think it's happening now.
Okay, great.
Nope. Oh wait, we see your notes screen, but not the presentation mode.
Oh no, okay, hang on.
It might be the screen, which screen you've shared, if you've got multiple screens.
I'm so shit at this. Okay, hang on a second. Let me just shut off that one. And remove the notes, and then start it again. Let's just see if that works. If not, there's nothing much I need to put on the screen. No, that's still not working, is it?
Well, I don't think you've shared the screen this time. Can you try the screen share?
Yeah. Screen share, come on. Okay, let's see if that works.
Success.
Yay! Okay, right now I've got my other laptop with the with the script. Look, first of all, before I start, I just want to acknowledge that I'm sitting on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to Aboriginal elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to anyone in the room. And I want to acknowledge that this is a sovereignty that's never been ceded. Now, my paper is a little bit different from everyone else's because I don't have findings as such to share, but this is more of a conceptual piece that I was invited to contribute to a special issue on chemsex cultures and sexualities, currently under minor revisions, so fingers crossed. So I want to work through this sort of conceptual underpinning then with you. So just to start, in case anyone has been living under a rock, the term chemsex refers to the use of illicit substances to facilitate, prolong, or enhance sexual encounters, and notably among men who have sex with men. In both popular and public health attention, we've produced this notion of chemsex as a concept of, or an object of considerable concern in gay and bisexual for men, gay and bisexual men, and that concern gets deployed in both gay and mainstream media outlets. At the same time, it's being treated as an object of concern in policy and programming in those overlapping fields of HIV prevention and LGBTQ community health. So what I want to suggest is that this has now moved from being just merely a description of a set of practices, and it's come to reference an identifiable set of circumstances and behaviours that are ascribed to gay male culture. And this is despite the diversity of settings, relations and practices that comprise chemsex in any given time or location. Just moving the slide. So increasingly, we can see that the word scene is used in association with chemsex in media reporting, expert commentary, and research on the phenomenon. And this notion of scene is used to refer to either a general concentration of people, places, and practices that give rise to the conditions associated with a combination of sex and drugs. So, for example, a gay scene, or the specific cultural coherence attributed to a repeated set of events that normalise drug-enhanced sexual activity. So, for example, the chemsex scene. So, in short, chemsex scene has now achieved a distinctive cultural form, at least in its rhetorical operation alone. So, rather than dismissing the coupling of chemsex and scene as mere rhetoric, I think there's value in further examining its suppositional capacity. And now by suppositional, I suggest that scene is not just capable of being deployed as a shorthand description, but rather scene becomes a more meaningful term that invokes a type of social organisation assumed capable of achieving a singular and tangible form, the scene, right? So scene for me is quite a fruitful entry point for exploring the combination of sex and drugs and how that combination achieves cultural salience over time. So I just want to briefly explain the emergence and subsequent expansion of scene theory so that I can consider more fully the conceptual flexibility it offers for us for chemsex. So the foundations for scene theory, I don't know whether this is known to you, were first laid in the 1920s with the concept of subculture that originated in research on juvenile delinquency and deviance. The concept was then broadened within the social sciences throughout the 1960s and 70s with an emphasis on post-subcultural theory. So it's prompting a move towards a consideration of scene's own conceptual distinctiveness. Since the early 1990s, scene has been consolidated into, consolidated in music studies as a means of studying the intersection between music and everyday life. And a number of influential essays have characterised the transformation of popular music cultures in specific locales. And one case in point is Will Straw's work. And this is a new kind of academic formalisation of the term that pulls scene beyond its colloquial and journalistic usage and towards an understanding of it as a set of circuits or pathways. An essential feature of this newly invigorated theory is that scene should be viewed as the making and remaking of alliances rather than scenarios of cultural fixity and totality. So most recently, scene has been recuperated from this tradition of music studies and has been applied conceptually across diverse domains of social life. So scene has now become a transferable concept that can be used to describe the participatory nature of any social or cultural activity that involves a form of mobile sociality. And this has generated a shift whereby scene is deployed as more of a perspective rather than an ontological object. So for example, on the screen there is a special edition of cultural studies where Benjamin Wu, Jamie Rennie and Stuart Points advanced an analytical stance that they call scene thinking. And the idea of scene, they say, can lead to new ways of thinking about contexts and cultures of activities that exceed questions of definition. And this reformulates scene as a sensitizing concept. So that is an idea that gives the user only a general sense of reference or guidance when they're approaching these kind of empiricals. So the value of scene thinking for me is that it can accommodate how scenes function as social relations in which shared experiences, affects and identities are generated through the process of participation, at the same time as mitigating the need for any kind of cultural or political cohesion prior to its investigation. So if all we want to do is invoke a sensibility or an orientation towards a phenomenon that can never really be known at the outset, and I would say chemsex is an example of that, then thinking with scenes requires us to bracket chemsex cultures as a scene and then move on to consider its constitutive elements. So scenes are constituted by diverse activities, and the practices that one person may determine as essential defining element of a scene may appear to others to be residual or secondary. Think about that in terms of any scene that you can think of: roller derby, drinking, bar scene, foodie scene. You know, there might be a central activity, but there's a whole myriad other ways that people are engaging with these particular spaces and activities. So chemsex scenes accord with this formulation. While they may be defined by the central representational practice of using drugs to have sex, the cultures that these practices support comprise a range of other activities: chatting, chilling, watching porn, so on, that may seem at first incidental to its more instrumental ends, that is, using drugs to achieve sexual gratification. As such, the specific combination of sex and drugs designated as chemsex are enmeshed within a multiple other modes of seemingly insignificant interactions that form the backdrop of scene activity. So because scenes coalesce around indeterminate yet intersecting fields of interest or affinity, the criteria for affiliation, at least for outsiders, is not necessarily self-explanatory. What potentially links an almost inexhaustible range of activities held in connection to any scene lies within the moments of everyday sociality that are dispersed within these more spectacular or visible manifestations. So while participation in sex scenes is made viable both practically and symbolically by the sex and drug-taking practices that are ostensibly the key function of each event, these wider social and sexual networks become reanimated by virtue of comprising committed or passing participation in the scene. And in doing so, the more expansive reach of these diverse activities are cemented in association with the chemsex practices that give them the raison d'etre. This suggests that chemsex scenes do not pre-exist forms of participation that give them those contours, but the chemsex events are entrenched within and are sustained by the expansive social repertoire of participants. At the same time, scenes function as sites for all types of affective investments in experiences that can't often be quantified or collated. And scenes often draw on these experiences of indeterminate social reality, relationality, that kind of push against other cultural models. So consider, for example, we have these partial feelings of belonging in scenes as compared to the more formal ongoing membership in defined subcultures. So following this idea, chemsex scenes can be considered the loose organisation of a series of events in which affinities to a combination of sex and drugs are expressed and enacted amid other practices and investments. And this can be understood as a form of cultural organisation, where it's turning discrete practices into something legible and coherent. So while scenes occupy a recognisable place in everyday life, they also function as an imagined alternative to the mundane. They lift us out of our everyday life. And this can likewise be seen in the consumption of drugs for the purposes of sex, which can offer participants something meaningful in the form of what Christian Moeller calls categorical overflow in his similar work on chemsex. So this overflow can be read in similar research that examines drugs from the perspective of play, subject formation, Kerryn, I'm using your work there, community building, and even the search for love, all of which extend analysis beyond those immediate and temporary drug effects. So this suggests that participation in chemsex scenes can generate feelings of affinity and collective meaning making that coalesce into something that's felt in excess of the materiality of the drugs or sex at chemsex events. And while no two chemsex scenes can ever be identical, they are united by the process in which the combination of sex and drugs becomes symbolic of broader moments of cultural significance. And the representational practices of participants strengthen the scene's presence in globalised contexts, giving singularity to what are otherwise discrete and diverse local iterations. And we see that, you know, when people talk about the chemsex scene. So to date, So to date, much of the ethnographic and other empirically derived research into chemsex cultures has focused on the role of apps that function as technologies into which chemsex events are organised or can even take place remotely. Zoom, for example, is a technology that allows chemsex events to happen virtually. Crucially, what unites these local events that comprise the culture of chemsex is their repetition. Scene participants start to partake in a kind of ritualised regularity over time. And like in other scenes, elaborate ethical protocols around chemsex are generated and norms of behaviour are integrated within those mundane forms of everyday sociality. And these processes transform makeshift or improvised conduct into a recognisable mode of engagement. And the repeated cycle of social and cultural practices forms these normative or common sense aspects of chemsex scenes that become more potent and entrenched as the scene grows and takes in new spaces and participants. So rather than what we might conventionally think of as a spatially oriented object, scenes in this particular formulation of mine are a temporally structured process. So extending those earlier formulations while keeping that temporal characteristic of scenes in mind, I'm going to suggest that chemsex cultures lie somewhere between the mutually constitutive processes of fixivity and movement. So, on the one hand, participation at drag king events can be felt as something precariously constituted, something that's not quite formalised into something solid and enduring, like, say, an institution. On the other hand, the chemsex scene is capable of collective consolidation into this widely recognised social form, which then can be taken up and reiterated by various stakeholders. So scenes necessarily prompt a process of reflection that is conditional, so for example, on the desire to locate a shared form of experience, and speculative as to what that experience might mean. And now, crucially, scenes are never realised as scenes in the moment of their living, and they are only retrospectively and prospectively consolidated and given their suppositional form. As such, we can view scenes within, as a temporarily organised by the process of meaning making that takes place within the more everyday practices of social interaction. And most of these interactions take place after that ephemeral encounter that prompted the reflection in the first place. So by critically interrogating the process by which diverse combinations of sex and drugs coalesce into more enduring practices, we can see how chemsex scenes intersect with yet exceed the affective experiences of everyday social and sexual life. So if chemsex cannot be adequately captured by demographically or spatially organised subcultures or sites, as I suggest, nor wholly encapsulated by the practices thought to be representative of them, then what use does scene in this more pragmatic sense hold for better understanding the complexity of chemsex? If we approach chemsex cultures through scenes, then we need to attend to the peripheral energies and relationships that exist in the processes by which chemsex becomes salient. At the same time, the immersive and embodied relations that shape and are in turn shaped by the chemsex scenes give rise to considerations of how the particularity of participation within local events is experienced. So this is a process, or an approach that positions scene as a collection of affective experiences, a process that generates a feeling of being in a scene rather than providing a description of the scene. Moreover, the temporal conditions of scenes invite further inquiry into how scenes take form and what opportunities exist to intervene at various moments to promote health and well-being for its participants. For instance, How can the colloquial and suppositional ubiquity of scenes be harnessed without predefining or predetermining its modes of engagement? And more importantly, how can we remain open to a scene's shifting morphology, but respond effectively to events that may have already passed? So rather than reifying scenarios as ideal or stable forms of social and sexual relationality, paying attention to how scenes emerge, are sustained and wanes allows us to consider multiple possibilities for engagement. So a scene perspective might allow for analysis of patterns of discernment and discursive processes that signal the formation of scene norms, an ethical framework that structures not only those modes of engagement, but how its participants conceive of themselves and their own roles within chemsex events. So I suggest there is both rhetorical and pragmatic value to a public health approach in providing a suitable framework for understanding chemsex practices and its cultures. The reality is that chemsex has now achieved political salience as a driver of policy, practice, and public health resources, which is often accompanied by the call to mobilise health services in response to a culturally competent service that specifically caters to the uniqueness of gay sex and gay culture. And this is welcome. But health promotion and harm reduction is far more nuanced and complex in practice. The key to understanding chemsex scenes that gay and bisexual men engage in lies in the capacities and opportunities that different settings, relations, and practices foster in combining sex and drugs in various ways, at the same time as acknowledging their capacity to shape future engagement through past reflection. So a scene perspective might allow for a more productive understanding of what scenes are and what they may become. And I'll just take a moment to acknowledge very various people from the Crystal Pleasures and Sex Between Men project, that research project that provided the stimulus for this type of conceptual work that I've just provided. And we are gratefully acknowledging all of our partners, stakeholders, and also study participants. Thank you.
Well done, Kerryn. Thank you. And thank you all our presenters for keeping to time so nicely. That means we have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So I'll start with Kerryn's question to you, Gabe. Do you see the question in the chat screen? Challenging assumptions about young people and alcohol. Shall I read it out? Or?
Yeah, no, I can see it. So I'm just having a read through it now. 1 second.
I'm sorry, it's so long too. I tried to capture it in the bite-sized like window, but yeah.
No, it's I appreciate detailed questions, and actually maybe this textual mode of communication fosters these more in-depth forms of engagement.
Yeah. No, cool. So I've just read through it then. Yeah, really interesting. It's funny you mentioned that because an earlier paper we worked on actually looked at how young people enacted this kind of sense of pleasure through forms of non-drinking and through kind of maintaining a sense of self-control. And it had these very strong ties to kind of these neoliberal subjectivities where people felt that they needed to maintain a sense of self-control, and that made them feel good about themselves. So when they'd go out and they'd be around others drinking, and they'd go out to parties and they'd see other people drinking and getting intoxicated, they'd feel good about themselves because they weren't in that state, and because they had control over their bodies and their emotions, which they saw as the loss of which they saw as a kind of more of a negative thing. And that's not to say that I mean, I do try and highlight that quite a few of the young people in that sample did drink, and they drank a small amount, and they would go out and they would enjoy drinking small amounts regularly. But there was very much this tipping point where they had pleasure through drinking somewhat, but not losing that sense of control, that self-control, and that kind of this neoliberal idea goes through this paper, and it goes through all my papers. A lot of the way young people talk about maintaining control and responsibility is just something that reoccurs all the time, which is really interesting.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating.
Can I, as the chair, boldly pose a follow-up question or two to that engagement gate? Because I was very interested in some of the intersections in what you were presenting and some of the work on smoking as well. So in terms of the work that the participants were doing, my first question is, did you have a sense of what kind of work they were doing, what types of employment they were engaged with, and where they were doing that work? How did location, place, urban, rural play out or intersect with those findings? And I was particularly interested because of some of the findings in our research on smokers, where particularly bus drivers talked about not being able to drink because of the requirement for their work that they have no blood alcohol level when they show up for work. So instead, smoking is the way that they engage in relaxation that really aligned with what you were presenting from Adorno. So I'm also kind of interested in this intersection across place, class, type of work as well, because of some of the research that talks about smoking, drinking, other forms of drug taking or use of chemical substances as drugs of solace. So over to you.
Yeah, sure. I'll try cover as much of that as I can. Just in terms of work, and just off the top of my head, so a lot of them were involved in sort of casual or part-time work. I think it was roughly half the sample. But this was kind of very few hours per week, and it was often casual in the sense that, yes, it was employment casual-wise, but also casual in the sense that they would reduce their working hours when they needed to during the school semester. A lot of them talked about working more over the holidays and working more when they had these kind of periods of time, or working on weekends. And it's interesting that they talked about work as something that could be like a productive thing. Like work is an escape from study. So it's almost this weird kind of release from the pressures of education and study for some of the young people. And work was very much a way for them to, kind of feel a sense of independence as well. Once you're employed, once you're earning money, you become somewhat economically independent. But there were also a lot of people who talked about doing kind of volunteer work as well, and doing work at kind of community sporting clubs, community charities and things like that. And it was something that, kind of they did as well on the side, but they talked about it being, part of something that could help them get their next job, or help them to put on their CV, to help them get something else further down the line as well. In terms of place, so the majority of the participants were from inner or outer metropolitan Melbourne. We did have some from kind of more regional areas. And it was interesting because the ones who talked about, off the top of my head, the ones from more regional areas did talk about alcohol use somewhat differently, because they talked about it being very much a normal thing, because you're in a regional area, you go to a party, everyone at the party, everyone drinks, that's the norm. But then they also talked about wanting to come to the city for some nights as well. And if you were in a regional area and you did want to come to the city, that was more of an effort, and that would tend to not involve drinking, or not drinking very much as well, just purely because of that travel time. So depending on where they were based or where they would go out, the kind of drinking scene was quite different as well. I think there was a third part of your question that I can't quite remember, sorry.
It was just in terms of how this links in with the notion of drugs of solace, of alcohol being a way potentially, particularly for people who are in difficult situations, to engage in escapism, or how the drinking was conceptualized perhaps differently to that scholarship on drugs of solace.
Yeah. So, I mean, the way people talked about drinking as a form of escapism, it was actually interesting, because there seemed to be quite a lot of stigma around drinking alcohol as a form of escapism, which was really interesting, because these young people would talk about they would never want to drink alone. They would never want to drink as a form of stress release, because drinking had all these kind of negative implications. It was, you know, associated with these sort of addiction discourses as well. And if you're drinking in these situations, you're drinking alone or you're drinking to relieve stress, that's kind of like this dark downward spiral people talked about. And in that sense, they actually talked about drinking in a similar way to a lot of other drugs as well. So they kind of, I think a lot more of the young people sort of associated the same stigma that were, in terms of that addiction discourse that is associated with other drugs, they sort of associated that with alcohol. That's not to say that alcohol had a role. So alcohol did have a role in these kind of social contexts when they were with friends, when they were having a good time, and that offered that kind of escape and that release. But outside of these specific contexts, alcohol was not something that they wanted to use, and there was a lot of stigma around using it outside of these contexts.
Great. Thank you for engaging with that multi-leveled question. Can I shift now to the question posed by Sarah to Kerryn? And Kerryn, you can then ask the follow-up question to Kieran's original one. And then I've got a question for Carys.
Okay, Sarah, so thank you for that question. The notion of scene offers a lot of benefit in drug research as it captures the affective and aesthetic engagements people have. Would it work for more mundane affiliations and collectivities? Yeah, absolutely. I originally formulated this notion of scene when I was doing my work on drag king cultures as social scenes for lesbian and queer women. And I definitely took it from its much more mundane definition of scenes. So, you know, as I said, like drinking scenes, bar scenes, but even reading groups, sports affiliations and things like that. What the basis of that is that there is a particular combination of practices and people and places that build these kind of really temporary affinities that then get solidified retrospectively. So the main point is that no one ever goes to a bar and says, I'm in the bar scene, you know, or I'm in a roller derby scene. But this scene sort of develops its contours retrospectively. And so that's my argument, that it's a temporally structured process rather than a spatialized object. Yeah, so what I'm interested in is how those affinities can get sedimented into something really meaningful. And then in that process, is there an opportunity to intervene at various points? So a lot of the literature that has specifically or explicitly use the notion of chemsex scene kind of suggests that it pre-exists particular people's movements in and out of it, that there's this thing called chemsex scene that exists, and then the idea of the interventions are basically to try to get people to move out of the scene. A lot of the harm reduction strategies are built around that, you know, having other social networks or getting Grindr off your phone and things like that. And I wanted to think more constructively about how people who use drugs, especially in the context of sex, actually have some sort of agency and role in the formation of scenes rather than just treating it as this negative kind of entity that one has to remove oneself from. My follow-up question is actually touching again on the drugs stuff and the last sentence on Kieran's question. And I was really struck, Gabe, by this notion of being productive. And this is obviously in the context of young people's work life or social life or life in general, where drinking is seen as an unproductive waste of time, I guess, or waste of productivity. And I think Kieran's alluded to this with the controlled loss of controlled or calculated hedonism, which is of course used in alcohol studies. Have you ever has that notion of productivity, you know, maybe timed drinking sessions for instrumental ends like, say, sociability, was that kind of expressed by any of your participants at all?
Yeah, good question. I think so, in the sense that, you know, I mean, drinking was something that, even though the participants didn't necessarily engage in it excessively, it was something that a lot of their friends did, and they were part of kind of these social networks where drinking was still quite common. And they took on these roles when they were part of these social networks, whether it was, you know, they enjoyed being out with their friends when they were drunk. Sometimes they enjoyed that. They enjoyed, these drunken antics, and they didn't want to miss out. That's that kind of element of, FOMO. When you don't go to a party, you don't know what happens. So even if they went out and they weren't drinking, they were still kind of part of that kind of context as well. And they had these memories, and some of them talked about, like, I can remember the night and everything that happened the night a lot better than everyone else. So in a sense, they were still socializing, and in a way, you could say potentially more productively.
Rather than designated drivers, they're like designated memory keepers.
Yeah, in a sense. And sometimes designated carers as well. Some talked about, like, I don't want to drink because I want to be able to look after my friends as well. So sometimes they took on these other roles as well as part of that. Sorry, I'm not sure if that completely answered your question. There's definitely that controlled loss of control is still something that I think is important to a lot of young people, and it was important to the friends of the young people we talked about. But for them, it was different. They enjoyed a different aspect of going out and going to parties as well.
Thank you so much. And that's interesting that Rebecca raised that issue of drugs of solace, where I was recently reading that cannabis, which is often understood as a bit of a harm reduction technique to stop using other more harmful drugs, has now actually started to become a bit of an issue for some marginalised populations, and is now, it's interesting that that in your participant, young people are treating alcohol the same way they would treat any other sort of substances which are understood as risky or harmful, or in this case, unproductive. And while I guess in my generation, it's been a hard slog trying to get people to recognise alcohol as a drug.
Yeah, and I mean, there's just this clear risk discourse that goes through the way young people talk about it, where they talk about going out drinking on a night out, or drinking excessively, into the future, and ruining their chance at whatever. It's there are so many risks, and it's about managing risks, and it's about being in safe spaces, being around friends, being not getting too drunk. Even if you drink, you don't get too drunk. And of course, I'm only speaking to the participants we talk to, but yeah, the risk discourse is quite clear, and their techniques of mitigating it were really kind of prominent.
Lots of responsibilization. Carys, I was wondering, kind of aligned with the discussion that we're having here about these notions of risk and alcohol, as well as how we conceptualize mental health. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about how things like alcohol abuse, what was the kind of deciding line when the data, it was determined that yes, this participant this data is alcohol abuse, this is not, as well as mental health conditions. What kinds of mental health conditions were included? How long did a person have to be kind of deemed to be experiencing this condition? How long did they have that diagnosis?
Yeah, thanks for the great question, Rebecca. Yes, so because this is a key thing when we're doing research about things that are highly stigmatized, right? It's particularly difficult when you've got self-report measures like what was used in this survey. So that's a big part of the reason, I think, why there was such a low incidence of substance abuse reported in this sample. So we looked at only parents or adults living with children under the age of 18. So they were responsible for the care of minors generally. And the question that was posed to them by the interviewer, face to face in their home normally, was, do you currently have a substance abuse problem? And so, of course, like pretty much no one said yes. And so that's, whereas say with the National Drug Strategy Survey, they use other measures that are more about, so what about like this drug? Like, have you used this drug in the last 12 months? Have you used this much? Like, how much alcohol have you used? So much more fine-grained questions that I think are easier for people to admit to. Somebody might be willing to say, yes, I've used marijuana at some point in the last 6 months, as opposed to, do you have a substance abuse problem? And then similarly with the mental health rates, so the question that was posed to participants in the National Health Survey was, do you currently have a mental health problem that you are managing with treatment or medication? So that's also a very narrow definition of mental health problems that's requiring treatment. Whereas like most, a lot of mental health problems are never diagnosed, let alone treated. And yet, even with that narrow definition, we still found about 20% of these parents said yes. So that to me was quite interesting, because both of these measures are asking people to self-report having a problem with things that are quite highly stigmatized. And yet the mental health item didn't seem to really lead to an underreporting, whereas the substance abuse problem did. So in my other research that I've conducted for my PhD, I've used the longitudinal study of Australian children, and like for one of my studies, and for measuring parental substance use problems in that, I've used proxy measures that have used questions about how much parents drink. So it's more like, how often do you drink? And then they use that to calculate, based on the NHMRC guidelines, what is considered to be like risky drinking, what is considered to be non-risky drinking. And from that sort of less of a aggressive approach to asking this question, I found that it's much higher. It's about half of all parents actually have substance use that is potentially problematic, even if they don't themselves recognize it to be so. So that's part of what I look at in my PhD, is sort of like how important it is that we ask the right questions, because these things have got such pervasive outcomes for children, for families. So yeah, it's really important how we actually look at them.
Yeah, and it sounds like if you were asking games participants, they might see all this drinking as much more high risk than the parents in your study. Thanks for that, Carys. There are just a few questions for me that I'll attend to quickly, and then see if there are other questions for all of our presenters. So Gabe asked, I'm wondering how participants talked about stigma they felt or received when dealing with healthcare providers. I think, like what you were saying, Carys, with our study, the participants didn't talk much about stigma in engaging with the healthcare providers, and this could be because of where the study took place. It was conducted in a hospital directly following a lung screening, excuse me, and all of the all of the healthcare professionals who were involved in conducting the interviews had some experience in doing kind of smoking cessation counseling. So there was definitely a high chance that they would not have been perceived as kind of a neutral party in the interview interaction. And this is in contrast to research from the US, where that I was presenting on in some of the earlier literature review slides, where there was definite acknowledgement of healthcare professional stigma as a barrier to going to any kind of lung screening, where in the US it is a national lung screening program. But the other limitation is that we, of course, only had in our sample people who agreed to engage with the screening process. So that is an implication for further studies, that we do look at people's emotional engagement and experiences or not of stigma in deterring them from even engaging with the lung screening. And Kerryn, you asked intersections with your work on emotions and affect. I wonder if there are any affects that may be felt that don't get converted into emotion, but can still be approached as barriers to screening. I think that's a great question. And we haven't, given the kind of makeup of the research team, and that it was more heavily swayed towards clinicians, and I was the kind of token social science researcher on the project. Rather than engaging with affect as it's kind of conceptualized in more of the kind of, geographies kind of literature, or more of a kind of post-humanist space, we have used what's called emotion tools. So it's more of a positivist physiological way of conceptualizing affect. So we did video the interviews, and we've got identifiers for like very split micro moments where facial expressions can be correlated with certain affective states, whether people are acknowledging that in their verbal communication or not. So that is hopefully an honor student project for next year to look at that data a bit further. But I agree, I'm very interested in taking what I call a post-paradigmatic approach and using physiological as well as far more narrative, participatory, a range of different theoretical and methodological tools, inclusive and beyond the physiological. And in terms of Kerryn, you spoke about productive or beneficial aspects of screening. So we did have people talk about pride, and in another paper, I'm working on happiness and smoking, and imperatives for happiness and imperatives for health, and how they intersect with non-cessation, smoking non-cessation. So yeah, that's watch this space. I'm trying to work on that paper this week. But thank you. I think that's a really important comment, because we do focus far too much on disparaging talk when it comes to smoking, and that is reflective of the public health domain that we're engaging with. A lot of the stigma is very it comes across as very harmful, and like we saw with that quote with the participant who was crying and sniffling, nobody cares about us as smokers, we're just addicts that don't deserve care. There's a need to kind of recognize the smoking scene, if we want to call it that, from eras past, that a lot of the participants talk about in the study, where before they were 18, the Marlboro Man was a big advertising trend. We saw cigarettes being passed out outside of schools. Cigarette companies were promoting sporting events, and most of these participants were smoking before the age of 18. Yet in the same interview, of course, and this is why we took a semi-narrative approach in our other parallel project, in the same narrative, the same interview, they're talking about willpower being important, and perhaps there's that dual recognition of addiction and smoking very much being part of everyday life in eras past, but now it's a risk and it's a responsibility that an individual needs to manage. Yeah. So we've got a few more minutes before we should wrap up. Are there any further questions? I think this has just been I'm glad that we did save the questions for the end, because I think it's facilitated a great conversation across the interlinking presentations. So I'll
the idea of the sensory analysis is going to be so fascinating, and thinking about how, for want of a better word, atmospheres generate the idea of that you want to be in it or out it, and the idea of a clinical space is often considered to be a atmospheric barrier to health engagement, and there's been lots of work in trying to sort of like beautify the clinic, I think is Kane Race's argument, but also in a lot of LGBTQ health space engagement as well. It's that a welcoming atmosphere or an inclusive atmosphere is far more than just having a rainbow flag on the wall. So I think that is, I'd love to yeah, I'd love to see when you appoint a student to do that analysis and what that means for that, you know, for can lung screening ever be effectively productive, maybe even using Gabe's terms, or, you know, like how can that atmosphere be generated so that it's actually a facilitator rather than a barrier?
That's a great way of framing it. Thank you for that, Kerryn. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? I don't want to hog the question, so I'm happy to hold off if other people have questions.
I think you're okay. Unless Jenny and Dan, are there any questions from your end?
I was thinking about that, just what Kerryn's just said then, Kerryn has just said, in terms of productive affective spaces, and that they don't necessarily have to be so-called positive affective spaces, that it could be a space to grieve or to share your fears or something like that as well. So thinking beyond those kind of positive, well, so-called positive affects, that that ones that are sometimes deemed negative can be productive as well. Yeah. But I think, do we finish at 4? So I've got one.
Oh, we do finish at 4, so we should wrap up, huh? Shall we say goodbye? And then Kerryn, if you did want to ask your final question, you're welcome to, and I won't end the session on you. But if others have to go, bye, Sarah.
Thank you, everyone. That was fab.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks, Rebecca, for your great sharing.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, really well done, and thank you, and great presentations.
Thank you everyone for the great presentations. I'll echo that, Kate.
Thanks, everyone.